Hi, everybody. I'm Grace Stern. I'm the State Extension Master Gardener Program Coordinator. And in the past, I was a fruit agent in Central Virginia. I had a lot of peach and grape production in my region. I'm joined by Stephanie Romelchek, who is on the northern neck of Virginia, northern peninsula of Virginia, and Mark Sutphin, who's in Frederick County. They both have some fruit history and fruit production responsibility out there. We're going to start with a presentation from Stephanie, and then I'll present, and then Mark will present, and we'll do questions at the end. So Stephanie, do you want to go ahead and start us off? Looks good.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. We're glad that you're here with us today. I am going to be sharing some basic information, and really all of today is basic information. We want you to get some basic terms and basic concepts down before we start going further into some of the more specific fruit information as we go on with this webinar series. So let's go ahead and get started. And I'm going to talk about where different types of fruits fall into the different categories. So if you hear some of these terms, you will know what types of fruits we're talking about. So stone fruits are fruits that have a hard pit inside of them that contains the seed. And they include fruits such as peaches, plums, nectarines, cherries, and apricots. Pome fruits are fruits that have a core of seeds in the middle of them that is surrounded by an edible layer of fruit. And the fruits that fall under pome fruits are apples, pears, and quinces. So you may hear the terms brambles or caneberries, and they're terms for the same group of plants. These plants are plants in the rubus family that generally have thorny, arching canes and a perennial root system. So they include raspberries and blackberries. Those are the most common ones that we see, but there's also a number of other caneberries that you may know about or see about or have tried in the past. You may also hear the term small fruits, and small fruits are fruits that are produced on shrubs, vines, or herbaceous plants. And they're generally what we call the berries. So they include strawberries and blueberries, and what we just talked about, caneberries, so blackberries, raspberries, muscadines, and table grapes all fall under small fruits. And then we have the specialty fruits. So they're the fruits that don't fit anywhere else. And also generally in Virginia, they're not grown on a really large scale. So specialty fruits, these are just a handful, but there's many others as well, are pawpaws, figs, persimmons, pomegranates, cold hardy citruses, hardy kiwis, and again, there's many others that aren't on the slide as well, but generally they're the fruits that don't really fit under the categories we talked about before. A term that you're going to hear about is grafting. Grafting is joining two parts of a plant to form one plant. When you graft plants, the top part of the plant is called the scion, and the bottom part is the rootstock. Why do we graft? We graft mainly to keep things true to type. A lot of our fruit trees won't produce based on just planting a seed. They won't be, if you planted a Granny Smith apple seed, it doesn't produce a Granny Smith apple tree. And they also don't do well with cuttings. And so a graft is the best thing we can do to keep something true to type. Grafting also helps a lot with size control, especially in our tree fruits. So it helps with dwarfing the plant. We also choose our rootstocks based on what kind of disease resistance it might impart onto the plant. And grafting can also promote earliness. And by earliness, I mean faster maturity, getting to fruit production sooner than we would if we didn't have a grafted plant. There are a lot of things to consider for cultivar selection. I've listed a number of things on here. There's many more things to think about as well, but I would suggest the most important thing is adaptability to your area of Virginia. That is probably the most important thing. I'm in Eastern Virginia. We don't grow apples really well in this area, right? And if we do, we need to choose ones that are really better adapted to the conditions that we have here in Eastern Virginia, because we're not in a cooler area in the western part of Virginia. So again, there's a lot of things to keep in mind for cultivar selection, but number one priority is making sure it's something that will work in the area that you will want to grow this in. Some other terms that you'll hear us talk about is pruning and training. And just so we're all on the same page, training is manipulating a plant's growth beginning soon after planting to direct the growth into a desired shape and form. Pruning is removing a portion of the plant to correct or maintain the structure and the form of that plant. When you do both training and pruning, it creates a really strong framework that supports fruit production. Why would you prune and train? One, to regulate growth and make sure that that growth and the structure of the plant can bear the weight of fruit production itself. Two, to improve fruit size and quality. And the last reason, again, is to control the size of that plant. So with that, I will hand it over to Grace.
Fantastic. I am going to share my screen and go through some more fruit pruning considerations. And let's see. Okay, right. So fruit growing considerations. I'm going to go over some general considerations. First thing that it's really important to remember is the perennial nature of fruits and fruit plants. So unlike vegetables that you might be used to, or for some of our agents, if you're used to advising row crop production, there are some things to take into account about growing tree fruit or small fruit or specialty fruit that is specifically related to the perennial nature of the plant. So there is a long-term commitment in addition to what we're going to call delayed gratification. Most fruit crops take 2 or 5 years to bear a significant harvest. Some, depending on their suitability to the location, might take more. Some might take less than is like advertised. But you're looking at something that's going to be in the same spot for I would say a minimum of 5 years to determine if it's being successful, and probably up to 15, 20 or older years on your property. So you need to be very, very careful about how you prepare your planting to make sure that the plants get the best start and that you are also prepared in terms of your time commitment. That is not just in terms of spraying or not spraying your plants, but it's also in monitoring for pest and disease. It's pruning and training, like Stephanie talked about, and it's the seasonal labor and maintenance of the plants and the permanent infrastructure. Many of these plants require trellising, fencing, sometimes windbreaks. Also because of that perennial nature and that permanent infrastructure, there's no rotating this away from pest problems or disease problems. If you have a problem in the soil where you plant it, it's not like you're going to dig it up and move it That's not recommended, right? So there are some important things to think about in terms of preparing your site, and those are primarily species or cultivar specific. So we want to be general in this presentation. So we're going to go over big picture, some of this stuff. So the first one I want to go over is site selection, and this especially want to focus on slope, because when we're talking about fruit, we're talking about things that primarily bloom in spring. And depending on the cultivar and the location, these things can be subject to frost and freeze damage, which we'll get to later. So this is a wonderful illustration from a vineyard textbook from Dr. Tony Wolfe at the Winchester AREC. And I want you to look at this picture and think about those purple areas as water. Cold air moves like water in the landscape. It flows downward. And you can see those areas of purple where the cold air is pooling. Those are bad sites. It's a bad place to plant your grapes. It's a bad place to plant anything that is going to not be cold hardy, right? So this doesn't just mean winter temperature and cold air settles in the winter when the plants are dormant. This also means any kind of cold fronts or anything. Those are going to be the coldest parts of your property always. When you're working with a small scale producer or a backyard grower or farm market scale producer, they are unlikely to go out and buy a separate piece of property just to grow blueberries or just to grow grapes or just to grow apples. To some degree, you're stuck with what you have. And my yard is only slightly sloped, but it's still sloped. So it's important to pick a planting area where that cold air is going to move off. So you can see that they've placed the vineyard here on the slope where the cold air comes in and it flows down and it flows off. If you were to, on the other side of that, plant your cold air, your vineyard over here, and then have a tree line here, or it could be a house. I've seen like long chicken houses do the same thing. You can actually pond that air up there. And so that would be, we make the site more prone to frost and freeze damage than this site. Additionally, factors for site selection is that some fruit needs a lot of sun. So you're going to want to plant on like a southeast or southwest facing slope if your fruit needs a lot of sun. If you're picking a cultivar variety that you're worried it might have too much sun, you would want to do northwest. I generally always recommend southeast, southwest, because we want to make sure that when the sun rises in the morning, it dries the leaves off and the fruit off and kind of reduces any wet, warm environment for disease. But we also want to make sure that you have the ability to warm up your plants first thing in the morning. You don't want to be in a spot that is shaded in the morning, especially in the spring. It can make your plants in the cold for longer. So, freeze or frost damage for longer. It's also essential to have well-drained soils. We'll go over that a little bit more, and prefer to always have somewhat of a slope so that cold air can run off. For our soils, you're going to want to have, for most tree fruits and most small fruits, a pH in the 6.2 to 6.8 range. There are some exceptions to that. In Virginia, we have some soils that trend to be acidic and some soils that trend to be alkaline. If you normally test your soil and you pull a really, really low pH, and you know that the planting that you want to do wants to be in that 6.2 to 6.8 range, you probably don't want to amend to 6.2. You want to try to amend to 6.8. If your soil naturally trends a little bit more acidic, you want to amend to a more alkaline end. So as the soil naturally changes back over time, that you'd have less additions and amendments to do. There's no good way to fix your soil after planting a perennial plant. Once that tree is in, once that blueberry plant is in, once that pawpaw is in, it's in. You're going to disturb the roots and cause injury and damage by amending soil unless you do it very, very carefully. And we recommend to pick a good site with well-drained soil and not wet well-drained soil, but just regular well-drained soil, right? On the slope, somewhere where the water also flows off. And always soil test before you amend, before you buy your plants. If you pull a soil test of like 7.5, 8, and then you want to plant blueberries that like acidic soil, you aren't going to be able to plant for quite some time, and those blueberries are going to sit in a pot forever. That is what happened to me. And then I killed my blueberry plants in a pot. So just be really patient and plan and soil test before you buy your plants or plant. Additionally, I'm going to talk about weather events and dormancy, and then I'll pass it to Mark. So we're going to talk about frost events and freeze events, which are different, hail and severe storm damage, and sun damage. All of these things are considerations that affect the majority of our fruits that we can grow in Virginia. So pop quiz. What's the most cold sensitive part of a fruit tree? You don't have to answer, but I hope you know, if you've had your botany classes, it's the flower. So what happens to a flower? What does it turn into? It turns into fruit, right? What happens if the flowers freeze and die? We get no fruit. None at all, no fruit. And that was a conversation I had over the phone multiple times as a fruit agent was, oh my gosh, what happened to all of my peaches? I don't have any peaches on my trees. And like, well, did you have flowers this spring? Yeah. When did your tree bloom? February. Oh, well, we had several frosts since then. That's why you don't have any flower. That's when you don't have any fruit, because flowers and frost equals no apples, no fruit. Let's go over a few definitions. Frost is different than freeze. A frost event occurs when the surface temperature of an object drops below freezing, even if the air temperature is above freezing. This is attributed to cold air moving in, moving like water, and you can kind of compare this to dunking a piece of fruit in ice water. Water with a lot of ice cubes in it, so it's pretty close to that freezing mark, and there's going to be some injury to the edge and ends of that fruit if you hold it in ice water for like an hour or two, but you're probably not going to completely destroy it, right? Ice crystals form at the surface of the plant. You don't necessarily have damage to the inside of the cells at frost. However, freeze is different. Freeze happens when the air temperature itself drops below 32 Fahrenheit or 0 Celsius, and it affects the whole environment. That means that the water that's naturally in those plant cells, whether that's fruit cells, stem cells, leaf cells, or flower cells, will freeze and expand. Plant cells have cell walls, and so when that water freezes and expands, which is normal thing to happen when water freezes, that cell wall ruptures and we damage our plant cells. So those flowers are really, really fragile and very, very susceptible to that kind of damage in frost and freeze. Once we get to some of our hardier stages of fruit, then like the actual apple itself or pre-bloom, they're kind of tougher. They can handle a little bit more. But this stage here where we're in bloom is very, very fragile. So frost versus freeze. When might frost or freeze be a good thing? I'm hoping somebody knows the answer. I'm not reading the chat to figure out who, but somebody knows the answer to this. Frost or freeze is a good thing because we have to thin our fruit. And this is something we're going to talk about a lot more in specific presentations in the future. If you go back and watch our reported peach presentation, there's some talk about thinning in there. If every flower turns into a fruit, what do you think that's going to do for the fruit? What do you think that's going to do for the tree? Are we going to get big, juicy peaches, or are we going to get a bunch of little bitty peaches? Or is the fruit going to mature? Is it going to cause undue damage and stress to the tree? This is a peach tree in full bloom, and you can see these smaller, thinner branches here have a lot of flowers on them. If every one of those turns into a full-sized, fist-sized peach or larger, that's a lot of weight for the branches, just in that fact. It's also a lot of nutritional load on the plant to produce that much fruit. And the plant doesn't have enough space. All of those flowers are very tightly clustered together. We can't quite have peaches that tightly clustered together, they'll fall off. So farmers thin to ensure a proper amount of stress on the plant, the right amount of fruit without overloading the plant or stunting its growth, and and while still getting a good crop, right? So sometimes frost and freeze is not a bad thing. It provides a little bit of natural thinning, and you might hear some commercial growers talk about not being particularly worried about a frost. However, if you have already thinned, if you bloom thin and then you get a frost, you might already lose, a big portion of your crop. Additionally, if you have a bunch of freeze events or frost events, back to back, or, at far enough stages where you're hitting all of those blooms as they open, then you might lose all of your flowers and you might lose all of your fruit that year. But the tree will come back and bloom another year as long as we don't have some serious damage. We're going to talk about hail and storm damage. Hail and storm damage can be really, really hard on your plants. It's not just hard on ripe fruit, it's hard on the shoots, the buds, it's hard on the tree's structure, it's hard on the foliage. Damage to fruit is obviously that's the part we want to eat, but damage to foliage reduces photosynthetic capacity and can reduce the health of the plant. Anytime that you're causing damage to plant tissue, you're opening an opportunity, a window, a door for disease to come in. And so anytime you have hail, high winds, thunderstorms, anything that causes physical, mechanical damage to the plant, it's an opportunity for increased disease risk. The best thing for you to do after a thunderstorm, when you go out and you kind of do an assessment of what's going on with your plants, is to look at the things that need to get pruned out, and to apply any kind of fungicide you might need to apply, and to just basically monitor for secondary infections. For a well-established tree, hail, storm damage is kind of like being in a fender bender. You're probably going to be a little stressed out. Your car might have some injuries, but it's not going to really put you out, right? Versus like major accident. So this is something where you're like, hey, I should probably go take care of my tree. If you have other damage on your property, that's something to consider. And it can cause all those same problems to grapes and other small fruits too. So this is hail damage in grapes. Note that we've got some split and sunken areas here. This is what about and this property at that time had about a 30% crop loss. This is a slightly less damaged cluster, but with these berries here being injured, we're going to have a lot more opportunity for a disease. And with grapes, when you have disease enter a cluster like this, it can spread very quickly through the whole cluster. So it doesn't have to be 30% of the berries on the cluster that are injured for that whole cluster to kind of be toast. So my recommendation is obviously for a commercial grower, it's not practical, but for, you in your backyard, if you've got 2 or 3 grapevines, to go up and pull off the damaged ones to see if there's any way that you can still save the cluster. Because if you're like me and your grapevine is not your priority, you're probably not going to put a whole bunch of fungicides on it to prevent that. Additionally, we have this injury on apples. So this is hail injury on apples. This is representative of a block that had a 100% crop loss from a hailstorm in the previous year. Now, these pecked, damaged, dented areas might make that fruit unmarketable. When they're picked later, these are pink lady apples. They're going to end up picked in December. This was taken in late July. But that damaged flesh and the damaged skin is also an introduction for disease. And so we also have all these holes and shredding on the leaves on the trees. So for the farmer, for the producer, it wasn't worth them to pick it or handle this fruit themselves. They just counted it off as a loss. For you in your backyard or for smaller producers, there might be a desire to save some of this. Warning is that it's going to have higher disease pressure. The tree will probably have I have some other pictures from this, probably have some other damage as well. You want to be very conscientious of that. And then last, I want to talk about sun damage. Too much sun can be a bad thing, especially with varieties that are more suited to northern areas. So this is what sun scald and white droop disorder look like on raspberries. The last thing I'm going to go over is dormancy and chilling hour requirements. So dormancy is that period of rest that a perennial plant goes through, fruit crops included, where they're preparing for the next growing season. It's their rest, it's their hibernation. This is influenced by environmental factors and genetic traits in the plant. It also means that they have decided, we're going to anthropomorphize a little bit, decided to rest until they're ready to break dormancy. So breaking dormancy is a little bit complicated. If you're familiar with the growing degree day models for tracking pests and plant development, there are similar things for accumulating chill hours in dormancy. The chilling hours or dormancy requirements for fruits are the cumulative number of hours of cold temperatures between 32 Fahrenheit and 45 Fahrenheit required by fruit crops to break dormancy and resume growth. So the plants are counting chill hours and accumulating chill hours until they choose to break dormancy when they have enough. It's their way of tracking the winter to know when it's the right time to emerge to be competitive. If they break dormancy too late, they have a shorter season. They may not be able to produce fruit and seeds on the same timeline. They might be out of sync with pollinators and other favorable conditions. If they break dormancy early, then there's a risk of injury from winter temperatures, including frost and freeze. Chilling hour requirements vary dramatically by cultivar and fruit species. We'll use an example of a peach species. So peaches have a huge range of chilling hours. So you can buy a peach cultivar that has a 350 chilling hour requirement. It means that once it gets those 350 chilling hour requirements, it's going to wake up and it's going to start by blooming. And you might have a peach that does the same thing, but it has 1,200, 1,800 chilling hours as a dormancy requirement. If I planted a 350 chilling hour peach in Blacksburg, and we had the winter that we had last year, it would have gone dormant in the fall and started counting chilling hours, and then probably mid-December decided to bloom. That is a bad thing because there's a lot of opportunity for freeze and frost between December and like our frost-free date in mid-May. So we would need a cultivar that has a higher dormancy requirement, that has a higher chilling hour accumulation before it breaks bloom. So in Central Virginia, I recommended a minimum of 900 chilling hours for peaches. There's lots and lots of information on this. When you choose a cultivar, chilling hours are going to show up on your cultivar selection sheet. The information that you find online or get from the grower, they're going to know. And so I wanted you to be aware that you need to match your fruit crop to the appropriate chilling hour zones, because if you don't, you're probably going to regularly not get fruit. Okay, and that's it. It's Mark's turn.
All right, how is everyone? Um, Good to be with you this afternoon. My name is Mark Sutphin, and I am a horticulture agent with Virginia Cooperative Extension. I'm housed in Frederick County, the northernmost county in the state here in Virginia, and serve a 5-county region in the northern Shenandoah Valley. So primarily focused on commercial horticulture, also get to work with our Extension Master Gardener unit here in the northern Shenandoah Valley, and appreciate everyone joining this afternoon. I've been in this role now almost 14 years, since late 2011. So have really appreciated the opportunity to serve the local communities and work with Virginia Cooperative Extension in this way. I get to talk a little bit about pollination, fruit set, and early development of fruit trees, or really all fruit. And so starting with pollination, this is really our basic way, or plants' basic way and start of transferring their genetics and continuing their legacy and their DNA and fostering the next generation. A little bit about Botany 101 and the flower diagram. Most of us think of that first diagram that's titled 2A, where you've got a complete flower. All the male, female parts are together on one plant. We call that a perfect or complete flower, or monoecious, when the plant has both male and female on the same plant itself. Not every plant is like that. Even though most of our fruit species are monoecious with perfect flowers, we do have a few species that have incomplete flowers where the male and the female parts are separated. We even have a few plants, a few species where the male and female plants are separate plants completely. So one plant will only have female flowers consisting of the stigma, ovary, and the rest of the female reproductive parts. And another plant will have the male parts, the anthers, pollen, etc. So monoecious species in the fruit world, we've got a good list here. Again, most of what we think about in tree fruit and small fruit are species with the male and female together, complete in one flower. A few exceptions, you'll note pawpaw actually has imperfect flowers. Many people believe, I even thought this until recently, that pawpaw is male and female separate plants. But what happens with pawpaw is it does have male and female on the same plant, but they bloom at different times so that they cannot self-pollinate. And some other examples that you may be aware of in the garden, or more aware of, where you have this scenario of separate male and female flowers, are things like squash. You've got separate male and female flowers. Also corn, if you grow sweet corn in your vegetable garden, the tassel at the top of the corn plant is the male flower producing pollen. And then where the ear develops, that's your female, with the pistil and ovaries down lower on the corn stalk. Dioecious species, again, this is where we have separate male and female plants all together. Fig, kiwi, and persimmon are some common examples in the fruit world. In your garden, one that's likely more familiar to you would be something in the ilex family. Hollies have separate male and female plants. Most of us are growing hollies for the red berries, whether that's for benefit of wildlife or for the aesthetic value of that, or for cut arrangements at the holiday season of year. And you need a male nearby to make sure that you get those berries and those female flowers pollinated. Swinging back into fruit a little bit, and continuing on that conversation of pollination, we often have varieties that need cross-pollination, or are not able to self-pollinate. So both of these charts that are shown here are examples specific to apple. And you can see you have on that first chart to the left, you've got the listing of the apple variety there. And then the top listing shows you which other apple variety might serve as a pollinizer for that intended fruiting variety that you're growing. And the pollinizer is the male plant, or the plant from which you're getting the pollen from. where the male reproductive material is coming to pollinate your desired variety. Many of our fruit are self-pollinating, and you don't have to have multiple varieties. Apples are certainly one that is a good example where you typically have to have several different varieties to pollinate one another. The chart to the right, again, in apples, you want to think about your bloom time because not everything blooms exactly the same. So if you've got a female opening that you want pollinated, you've got to have the male or the pollen source opening about the same time, or overlapping that window when your female fruit is blooming. So you end up with charts like that for apple to let us know when and what varieties will overlap their bloom times. And I failed to point out on the left photo things like Jonagold, Matsu and Crispin, wine sap. They're just not great pollinators at all. So to give another example of where we had some self-sterile varieties, many of you may be familiar with the Bradford pear. So when it first came out, and of course we all know it's a terrible invasive at this point, but when it first came out, the Bradford pear, which is a cultivar of the calorie pear, it was self-sterile. It needed pollen from a different variety to be able to set fruit. The issue with that initial Bradford pear plant was they had terrible structure. They broke apart in wind, ice, and snow. So other varieties, other cultivars that had better structure were developed. You ended up with things like Aristocrat and Cleveland Select that then came on the market as other ornamental pears, all part of the calorie pear species. And now you had pollinizers for that Bradford pear. So now we have fruit setting on Bradford pears, and that's how we've ended up with this invasive problem of the calorie pear or Bradford pear. But that gives you an example of where you should have had a self-sterile cultivar. Pollination itself is the movement of pollen, whether that's on the same plant, on the same flower, from the male part, the anther to the pistil, or whether that's from a different plant. We move that pollen, and that pollen gets moved either by wind or some other environmental factor. Sometimes rain can spread pollen, or we rely on pollinators like the honeybee or other animals to do that task. In the fruit world, we've got some examples of plants that are pollinated by different things. Grapes are an example that are typically pollinated by wind. That photo in the center is a pawpaw bloom. Those blooms are pretty small and inconspicuous unless you look at them up close like this photo. They don't smell that great. They tend to smell like rotting fruit. So they're attracting things like beetles and flies to pollinate them. And then on the right, we've got an apple tree in bloom, often thinking of different bee species that would pollinate things like apples. And as Grace alluded, we only need about 10% of those blooms set or fertilized to develop a full crop load on something like an apple tree or a peach tree. So trees are typically overbearing and over fruitful. Again, it's nature's way of having some contingency plans and ensuring their offspring develop and survive. For us who want a larger fruit and are growing it to eat it, you need to thin it down so you have less fruit and grow that fleshy part of the fruit that's desired. So as we continue the pollination theme, many of us, and I think unfortunately, general society thinks of honeybee as really the only pollinator out there. Thankfully, our native bees are starting to get some more recognition and awareness. But that begs the question, do you need honeybees or pollination services here in Virginia to pollinate your fruit plants? Typically, you're not going to need the European honeybee here in Virginia. We have pretty diverse landscapes. Again, in the small production scenario in the backyard and home garden, you're going to have significant diversity. And here in Virginia, we have over 400 species of native bees. And with our broken ecosystems, they tend to do a pretty good job of pollinating most of our fruit species. So don't feel like you have to raise honeybees in your backyard so that you can set fruit of various species in your backyard. Those native bees and other pollinators will generally do that work. That being said, why is the honeybee used so much in agriculture? And that's because in our larger ag scenarios where you have larger continuous plantings that are more of like a monoculture, you have tons, and an abnormal amount of flowers that need to be pollinated at the exact same time. So honeybee is a species, again, a non-native to North America. It was brought over by the European colonists for honey and wax and pollination services. They're basically considered managed livestock, and you can move them around because they exist in a community hive and can pollinate these monoculture plantings that we see in some of our agriculture settings. But again, here on the East Coast, in the Mid-Atlantic, where we have an ample number of wild and native bees and other pollinators, you tend not to need honeybees in your backyard garden. Switching gears a little bit, wanting to talk about plant development, bud development. We often call this phenology, which is more of a scientific term for this. The bud development and flower development, it plays a critical role in some of our management decisions and various things that you will do as a fruit grower. So wanted to go over, this is the apple on the left and the peach on the right. You can see there, number one on the apple, that's the dormant stage. The buds are closed, it's still cold, nothing is growing. As you have reached those chilling hours that Grace was talking about, and the plant says it's time to grow and the temperatures are warming, day length is getting longer and longer, they start to grow. And number two is silvertip. That's just as those buds are starting to swell and break. And then as they break a little bit further, you see the tip of the first leaves coming out of that flower bud. We call that green tip. And then once those leaves have reached quarter or half-inch green, have grown a little bit, that's the next stage there at number 4. Number 5 for that flower bud, it's called tight cluster. Again, here in the apple scenario, Number 5 is tight cluster. All those blooms in one bud are still all together. Number 6 is pink, when the petals are starting to show color, the back sides of the petals, and those flowers are starting to separate individually, even though they're not yet open. And then we get to bloom, number 7, and petal fall once the flower has been pollinated, or it wasn't pollinated and conditions have warmed and the flower is spent, the petals fall off. And number 9 is where we have fruit set and those little ovaries are starting to grow. In the right graphic, you can see the example of peach, again, starting at dormant, number 1, swollen buds at number 2, 3, we've got half-inch green, again, with the first leaves starting to show. 4 is pink, again, coloration on the backside of the petals is breaking out of the flower bud and showing. Bloom is number 5. 6 is petal fall. Again, after the flower is pollinated or after the bloom is spent, if it didn't get pollinated. And then 7A, 7B is showing fruit set. 7A has the shuck on, so the sepals there are still kind of around that growing ovary. And as that ovary is growing and expanding, it breaks that off for 7B, and those are your baby peaches that you're seeing. And we've got similar phenology stages in the grape world, as well as some of our other fruit varieties. And wanted to show you again why this phenology matters. And Grace alluded to spring frosts. For many of our fruit species, they have differing cold hardiness levels of critical temperature that they can withstand at different phenological stages. This is showing some of our stone fruit, cherry, peach, and nectarine. And what this chart is showing is at what temperature can the plant withstand at this stage to kill 10%. So that first example in the swollen bud of the sweet cherry, if you have a minimum temperature at 17 degrees Fahrenheit, you can expect about 10% loss of flower bud at that temperature. If you get all the way down to 5 degrees Fahrenheit, you can expect 90% loss in that situation. And again, you can see as you progress across that chart, and as the plant is growing and setting flower, opening, setting fruit, that critical temperature increases. And so the closer you are to bloom or post bloom, that developing fruit is very sensitive to cold temperatures in really all species. Unfortunately, much of the mid-Atlantic, we were no exception here in Virginia, experienced a freeze event April 9th of this year, 2025. Really cold temperatures. Many of our peach trees, apples, peach trees in central Virginia were pretty much full bloom. They were blooming here in Winchester. Or starting to bloom. Apples were a little bit delayed, but we saw temperatures, at least here in the northern Shenandoah Valley, down into the higher teens, most all night or early morning hours of April 9th. So unfortunately, throughout the region, it impacts our commercial growers, but each of you as a potential backyard fruit grower, you may have seen most of your fruit freeze this year in that April 9th weather event. And then wrapping up, one more slide here for you. Another reason we talk about phenology and bud development and the stage in terms of management decisions. At each of these development stages, there are usually pest management decisions to make. And it often ties with the spray schedule that you may see in the pest management guide. So that table to the right is a screenshot from the 2025 Home Pest Management Guide, table 3.5, the spray schedule for apples. And if you notice, I know it's pretty small on the screen there, but if you look at the time of application for some of those fungicide and insecticide applications, you'll note the phenological growth stage that's being called out. So the first application of copper and superior oil is being applied at green tip at the beginning of bud swell. You can do that next application from delayed dormant to when the leaves are 1/2 to 3/4 inch long. The next one is titled pre-pink, and then you've got pink and bloom and petal fall, and then you get into your cover sprays, and we'll I'm sure hear more about these pest management decisions and how they apply to each species as we get into our different fruit species and future webinars. But cover sprays are where you're covering the entire plant, both the vegetative and the fruit that is growing, whether it's with a preventative fungicide or with the insecticide spray or the combination of both together. And then those are usually done at 7, 10, 14-day intervals, depending on the species and the products being applied. But that wraps up our beginning information, and we wanted to open it up to questions. Grace, Stephanie, and I are here to try to field some questions. I know there's been quite a few shared in the chat and dialogue there. So
Yeah,
Grace, I'll turn it back to you to moderate.
thank you, Mark. I think we've answered a lot of our questions in the chat. Feel free to keep adding them. I wanted to note that if you're interested in specific fruit species, we're going to be following up with about one webinar a month for additional fruit species. So we have our blueberry webinar in 2 weeks. Bill Klein from North Carolina State University and Extension is going to be presenting on blueberries. That's going to be a really great one. Then we have Dr. Doug Pfeiffer from Virginia Tech, who is an entomologist and integrated pest management specialist, who's going to talk about economic thresholds. So it's going to be determining whether or not you should be taking a measure, a spray measure or something like that, whether or not it's worth it. It's going to be really, really useful both for Extension Master Gardeners trying to advise backyard growers and home clients, in addition to agents being able to advise other growers. That should be a really helpful session. And then September is apples, and that's what we've solidified so far. We have a question: how can we minimize pest issues or fungal issues if we need to do emergency pruning of a peach tree due to heavy fruit load, if you didn't do a good enough job pruning in late winter? So that can happen if you don't thin and you've got a young tree and you've got a lot of fruit on it and your branch breaks. So my recommendation, if that happens, is to cut the branch off, do your emergency surgery pruning for that peach tree, and then thin the rest of the branches. You don't have to thin at bloom for peaches, and commercially we don't do that. We thin by hand. The rule of thumb, is 1 peach between the tip of your pinky finger and the tip of your thumb. Unless you are an exceptionally small person or an exceptionally large person, that finger to thumb, mine is about average, that finger to thumb, like wingspan, there should be no more than 1 peach here and 1 peach here to have a proper load on a peach tree. So that's what you thin to kind of prevent some of that damage. And in very, very early years or young years for those trees, you want to take off even more because they are small and weak. You don't give your child a giant bag of rocks to carry. You give them like one rock at a time. They want to help you out in the yard, right? So you got to really adjust that weight load on the tree to its age and its ability. Disease and pest pressure in those situations, when you take those fruit off the tree and you thin, especially if they've started to ripen, you're going to want to remove those away from the tree. Normally, thinning happens when peaches are about that big, and we don't have a big concern that those are going to like rot and attract insects and pests and stuff like that. But if you're pruning when they're larger, we're now almost in July. If that's happening recently, pruning when they were larger and trying to thin at this point, you should still take them off and still thin to this ratio, but you should probably take those away from the tree so there's no rotting fruit or insects attracted to the tree itself based on what you've pulled off of the tree. And depending on how badly the tree is wounded by that weight injury, there might be some kind of protective things that you can apply depending on the size of the wound. There's some good resources to write it down. But peach trees and all prunus species naturally do something, we call it gummosis. The liquid that flows through their xylem and phloem, when it's wounded, will combine to get this like sticky substance. And the purpose of that is to actually push stuff out of a wound in the fruit or the stem or the trunk or the shoot of the tree. And so if you see that, that's pretty normal. That was a very long answer. We do have a link for the blueberry webinar and Mark put it in the chat. I also have a link we have a whole separate web page, and they're also double listed on our ENG webinar page. And I will also be sending out advertisements for all of them. You do need to tune back into the FIG webinar for FIG specific info, unless Stephanie or Mark can answer questions on FIGs, because I cannot answer questions on FIGs personally.
I guess I was impressed that you must have your fig in a warmer location, because generally you'll get early fruit set like that when it goes through the winter and it's a fairly warm winter. I know one of my figs died back to the ground this year, and the other one I lost parts of my fig because it was so cold. So that's my first impression on that, is that you're getting a fruit set because it's early. But why it hasn't started to mature, I can't answer that question.
I also want to say that there's I have had luck with figs in ground. I have not had luck with figs in containers in Blacksburg. I think we're just too cold. No, I didn't pick like unhardy varieties, but I had some trouble with the Chicago hardy. But we do plan to have a whole separate fig presentation by a fig expert, which I'm excited for. What age of pear peach tree can you stop watering? That is really site dependent. So typically we say when you plant, you need to make sure you water in drought for fruit trees. Like we talked about earlier, they don't want wet feet. They do not want wet soil. It's not like watering a tomato. You want to make sure that you don't overwater. But once it's established, as long as you're not on like, that's why when we plant, when we are on the slope, we want to be on the slope. We don't want to be on the crest because all the water flows away from the crest. There's some other reasons too, but if you have a hill and you've planted your peach tree right here, you're probably going to water it a little bit more than if you planted your peach tree here. Right now in Blacksburg, we haven't had rain for quite some time, and it's been in the 90s. So I have to water my vegetables daily. My peach trees are still not wilting. They'll tell you. They'll flag. They'll tell you when they need it, and they're surprisingly resilient to that kind of stuff too.
I think establishment is considered typically 1 to 2 years. Would you both agree on that?
Yeah,
1 to 2 years for peaches.
the other piece I would add there, and I know this question is specific to pear and peach, but it also depends on the size of that tree. And I think when we talk about apples, we'll talk a little bit about the rootstocks and some of the dwarfing characteristics that you can get from the rootstocks. And if you're growing a smaller, very dwarf tree, it's going to be less resilient in a drought situation. So even though it may be 10 years old, it's not going to have as robust of a root system to survive that drought as would a larger semi-dwarf or kind of a standard tree that hasn't been quite so dwarfed. So keep that in consideration as you're evaluating the scenario.
I got another question about thinning peaches. The question was, can we thin just the thin pinky to thumb at flower stage versus at fruitlet stage? I would recommend at fruitlet stage when you've got that small, like little fuzzy green peaches. If you thin you can see you have to thin by hand. If you thin at the flower stage, you run the risk of damaging the other flowers and thinning too much. Additionally, you might still get a frost or freeze event, and that might still take out more stuff. So commercial producers thin at about that big or smaller by hand, and they thin to that distance, and that works really well for them. And while I'm thinking about it, we have a whole recorded peach webinar that includes stuff like this and pruning. The growers would tell me that when you're thinning, the best thing to do is just don't look down. Don't look at the fruit that you're taking off of the tree. Look at the fruit that's on the tree, because you end up taking off a lot of fruit, and that is okay. Because once you're at that fruit stage, they're very, very resilient to frost and freeze damage, and usually we're far past any of that frost or freeze issues for peaches. Any other questions? We are planning on doing, I will give you guys a heads up on the talks that we are hoping to get. We have a list of specific fruits that we want to go through. These are not scheduled already, but it's on our list. So we're planning on going through cherries, plums and apricots, strawberries, cane fruit, so blackberries, brambles, figs, American grapes, citrus, pawpaws, persimmons, hardy kiwi, and mulberries are what's currently on our list. In addition to the blueberries and apples that are already scheduled and the economic thresholds that are already scheduled. If you can think of something, another fruit, or if you think about something another time, please email me and make a suggestion. We will do our best to add some more talks and be superly well covered. Service berries, who I don't know, I've never eaten a service berry, but there are some other things, like I think I got a request for elderberries as well. If you want to email me, make a suggestion, you can email me at fruit@vt.edu. It's my email address, fruit@vt.edu. With that, thank you guys so much for joining us. I really appreciate the time. I hope you guys learned a lot. And a big thank you to Mark and Stephanie for organizing and presenting.